I'm Douglas Murray. I'm an author, journalist and director of a think tank called the Centre for Social Cohesion in London, which focuses on radicalism in the UK. I think one of the things that we've been seeing in recent weeks has been something that since roughly 2003, 2005 has been, to some of us, an inevitable process. In 2005, when Iraqis first went to the polls and defied the death threats made against them, it was the Lebanese Druze leader Walid Jumblat who said this was a Berlin Wall moment when people saw people in Iraq next door to them voting. It would be only a matter of time until they demanded that kind of vote themselves, demanded that kind of system. And I think that this has now started to come to pass. History never happens at the time you think it's going to happen. But I think this is what we've been seeing. For Egypt in particular at the moment, though, this is an extraordinarily delicate time. People tend to forget the fact that after revolutions, it needn't be the most popular party that takes power. It merely needs to be the most organised. And it's possible, and this is the great threat to Egypt and to Egypt's future, it's possible that the Muslim Brotherhood is both one of the most popular, if not the most popular, and the best organised at this time. So I think Egypt is heading into a period of terrible instability which is going to spill across the region. My hope is, obviously as everyone's hope is, that the Egyptian people actually have, instead of a totalitarian-style ruler like Mubarak, or an Islamist rule as the Brotherhood would herald, is that they have actually the opportunity to create their own democracy, create their own future. But, you know, as many people have said in recent years, democracy is a lot more than voting. It's about institutions. It's about civic tolerance. It's about, civic life. It's extremely hard to create and nurture. It's particularly hard to create and nurture after any dictator has been in power. The problem now for Egypt is that there has to be a transitionary process from Mubarak to whatever replaces him. That is something which allows the Egyptian opposition parties time to cohere and to form a meaningful alternative to the Brotherhood. But I very much fear, I know a lot of other people very much fear, that it's going to take too long. You know, in Britain we have this saying, you know, people who can't see the wood for the trees. One of the problems for Western governments in particular is that they look at things entirely in their own viewpoint. They look at things through their usual spectacles. You know, they visit the government in say, Turkey, and, you know, they have normal relations. It's all very pleasant. It's all done in the normal manner of diplomacy. And actually nothing about it is normal. Nothing about that facade is normal about what's happening in the region at the moment. Same in Lebanon, same in Egypt, same in the whole of North Africa, same in Jordan. It's a very abnormal situation that's going on. And the big story of our time, the increasing grip that Islamist ideology has on, in many cases, countries that used not to be going that way, is a story which the West has missed and continues to miss just as much, just as fully as they missed the Khomeiniist revolution in Iran. They've missed it because they're focused on the minutiae of the policies, the minutiae of trade agreement. Yes, they focus on all of the unimportant things in it, in the long scheme of things. And what's happening in the Middle East at the moment is, I think, to a great extent beyond the control now of Western governments. People in London are sort of saying, you know, what can we do about this? The answer to that is, to a great extent, very little indeed. And I think that just as a famous comment about the French Revolution, the impact of what's been happening in recent weeks is going to take a very long time to play out. And one example I'd give is this, is that when in 2009 the Iranian students took to the streets protesting against a government that is actively hostile to America, Britain and Israel, the American administration remained silent, didn't want to call. And the moment that people turned out on the streets in Cairo asking for the end of the Mubarak regime, a man who, for all of his faults, was nevertheless an ally of the West, an ally of America. Obama immediately called for him to step down. David Cameron in Britain, for what it's worth, keeps on saying, he has to go, he has to go. This is policy made up on the hoof, and it's a policy which is very dangerous, I think, because in the coming years, lessons will be drawn across the Middle East from that. There are already lessons being drawn in Iran from that, and there will be lessons drawn in other states. A country which is a bad enemy, just not very good at being an enemy, and not very good at being a friend, is in the end not a very good country. America, the West, should hope to be an exceedingly good foe and an exceedingly good friend, and that's been exactly reversed. I wrote a piece the other day in The Spectator in London about the thinking that's going on behind it. I would put it as follows. Those of us who were most vehement, most adamant about the need for democratic reform, particularly in Iraq in 2003, suffered two setbacks. The neoconservative argument, the democratic argument, suffered two terrible setbacks. The first was the descent into violence and bloodshed in Iraq, and the second was the election of the Hamas in the Gaza. These twin problems highlighted for many people the problem. It made, as it were, the democratic argument shudder. And I think, to an extent, neoconservatives, among whom I'd count myself, have to a certain extent become a new phenomenon of, remember the old joke was that neoconservatives were liberals who've been mugged by reality. This is neoconservatives who've been mugged by reality. It's a very interesting situation that's come about in the pro-democracy argument, because, as it were, the people who have been most pro-democracy, the most vehemently democratic in their debates, and myself included, are undoubtedly now the people who are most concerned about the Brotherhood, for instance, in Egypt and elsewhere. In other words, with the people who've seen how badly wrong it can go. I would argue, though, that there's a set of things that were the neoconservative way out of this problem. I'd say that something is being misunderstood in this, which is that two things. First of all, I think generally acknowledged thing now that democracy is, as everyone knows, everyone always says, far more than just turning up and voting. The second thing is this: democracies are not democracies that have parties in them that would end that democratic process. And this is one of, I think, the key things that whatever the new settlement in Egypt is, it has to take the following into account. One vote, once parties do not equal democracy. It's a member of the Muslim Brotherhood I was debating with on the BBC the other night. I kept putting it to him, and the liberal journalist who was interviewing us, kept trying to explain this to him, that, the election of the Brotherhood's wing, the Hamas in the Gaza, does not constitute democracy, because democracy does not involve getting to power, murdering your opponents, shooting them in the back, throwing them off buildings, and then never having an election again. That does not constitute democracy. The Hamas were meant to have elections last year. Guess what? No election. No word on that. For the left, by the way, who love to trump this, love to wipe this example in the neoconservatives' faces, for the left who most enjoy that, they should reflect perhaps now on whether the democratically elected government in the Gaza, as they always like to call it, is actually a democratically elected government in any meaningful sense. One vote once doesn't count. And I'd add one other thing to this, which is that we have been here before, and people should learn the lesson, I think, faster than some recent lessons. That's the example of Algeria. It will have to be the case in the new Egypt. It will have to be the case in the new Turkey, in any of the other countries that are going to suffer similar problems. That if a party comes to power that intends to end the democratic process, that party will be ended. And this is going to simply be one of the paradoxes which we have to get on top of the democratic process. Because, a lot of the people who are most gleeful about this situation. There are a lot on the left and elsewhere who are very gleeful about what is happening at the moment. We simply bear in mind, as it were, they want some of these experiments to fail. They want the democratic experiment to fail. But what's the alternative? You know, a little quoted person these days, but Condoleezza Rice said this some years ago. What's the alternative? It's a very, very important question. Is the alternative propping up Mubarak-like regimes? Because if so, it's an alternative that keeps on coming back to bite us. You know, I was in Egypt, 9 months ago or so. And one of the things that struck me there about the Mubarak way of governing the country was that, you know, there wasn't freedom of speech in Egypt under Mubarak, except for anti-Semitism and anti-Americanism. And those freedoms of speech were very happily exercised. So, you know, it's always been the problem with strongmen dictators like Mubarak, that they say they're doing everything they can, and they're doing very little. I mean, just on an anecdotal front, you know, I mean, taking the train one day last year from Cairo to Alexandria and mooching around the bookshops at the train stations. You know, if you wanted to read a cheap romantic novel for the journey, you wouldn't have found anything. If you wanted to buy a book, interestingly, you know, educating you on the local culture in Alexandria, pretty hard to find. But if you wanted to pick up several copies of Mein Kampf and a dozen copies of the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, you were in the right train station. Now, as I say, there is always going to be a reckoning. There is always going to be a result from cultures in which strongmen dictators are propped up and the people are fed a diet of that kind of rubbish. And we are starting to see it. And it's going to need a lot of care, a lot of managing, and by the way, also a lot of humility, I think. The American, British governments and others are going to have to recall that this must look and will have to be an Egyptian decision. And therefore, I think actually the government that's played all of these turmoils of recent weeks best has been the Israelis, who have seen that the best thing sometimes is to be silent and to allow people to realize that the future is in their hands, that the conspiracy theories that they've been fed for several generations now are not actually the way the world is run, and that if they are going to have a successful future, it'll be in their hands, and if they fail, that'll be in their hands as well.